Bibliophiles of the internet, we have blown right through July and right past the halfway point of the year, which means I owe you some serious second quarter reading stats. As always, credit to With Ali, who created a very detailed spreadsheet where I track all of my reading. Most of the data I share in these stats videos are collected in that spreadsheet, and the percentages and totals are numbers that I crunch myself. As we do every quarter, we're going to go over how much I read in the second quarter, my most read genres, most read reading formats, my tier ranking for the second quarter, how much I saved at my library, and so much more. So keep watching if you're interested in any of those things. Starting off, as always, with the big picture number, the total number of books I read for the quarter, and for the second quarter of 2026, I read a total of 43 books. Adding that to the 37 books I read in the first quarter, that means that I read a total of 80 books in the first half of 2026. That means I read just over half, or roughly 54% of all the books I've read so far in the second quarter alone. And in terms of reading pace, that still puts me ahead of where I was at this same time last year by 2 books. Now let's do a quick month-by-month overview of what I read in the second quarter, starting with the 11 books I read in April. Those were A Practical Guide to Dating a Demon, The Works of Vermin, Rake's Fall, Kareem Between, Fire Season, I'll Love You Forever, May and Malibu The Dream Team, A Prince Among Pirates, Ship Happens, To Ride a Rising Storm, and Blood in the Machine. In May, I read 14 books. Those were Change of Plans, Shapes of Love, Opting Out, The Last Contract of Isako, Startup Hell, The Brides of High Hill, A Mouthful of Dust, A Long and Speaking Silence, The Killing Spell, The Last Best Quest Ever, An Expanse of Blue, The Black God's Drums, For She Is Wrath, and Diamond Ring. And in June, I read 18 books. Those were No God But Us, The Lost Book of Lancelot, The Disaster Gay Detective Agency, Forgive Me Not, The Sons of El Rey, The Open Era, Ollie in Between, The Odyssey, The House of Now and Then, 30 Love, Son of the Storm, Perverts, Siren Queen, In Your Court, Muñeca, and I Wanna Be a Wall, Volumes 1 through 3. So we can actually see a steady upward trend going from April to June. That means I did roughly 25% of my quarterly reading in April, 33% in May, and 42% in June. Now let's talk about the total number of pages I read for the quarter. In April, I read 3,797 pages. In May, I read 4,263 pages. And in June, I read 5,616 pages, which means in the second quarter, I read a total of 13,676 pages. And to put that in some more perspective, that's about 1,700 more pages than I read in the first quarter of 2026. Next, we're going to take a look at my top 3 most read genres for the quarter, going in ascending order up to my most read genre. Kicking things off, we have romance. I read 6 romance books. And then we actually have a tie between 2 genres for the title of my most read genre in quarter 2. Those are contemporary books, meaning books that have both a modern day setting and that have no other genre inputs. By that definition, I read 14 contemporary books. And tied with that is fantasy. These can be books set in our world or a fantasy world as long as they feature prominent fantasy elements that strongly factor into the plot. So again, I also read 14 fantasy books. Next is a stat that I like to call how many were queer, in which I calculate how many queer books I read in the quarter. And with the second quarter overlapping with Pride Month, you can expect this number to be pretty high. And indeed, I ended up reading 28 queer books. That means well over half, or roughly 65% of all the books I read in the second quarter were queer books. Moving right along, let's talk about reading formats, going from my least read format to my most read format. I actually didn't do any hybrid or tandem reads this past quarter, so my least read format was ebooks, but even so, I still read 9 books as ebooks. Then we have physical books. I read 14 books as physical books, which I think is pretty good. And surprising no one for the I don't know how manyth quarter in a row, audiobooks absolutely dominated at 20 books. Speaking of audiobooks, let's look at how many hours I spent listening to audiobooks in the second quarter. Now, this is not exact because for the sake of simplicity, I usually round my audiobooks either up or down to the nearest half hour in my spreadsheet. So I listened to roughly 80.5 hours in April, 52.5 hours in May, and an absolutely untenable 93.5 hours in June, which means this past quarter I listened to an estimated total of about 226.5 hours of audiobooks. To once again put that in a different metric for some perspective, that's as if I spent 9.5 straight days doing nothing but listening to audiobooks. And interestingly enough, even though I read more in the second quarter compared to the first quarter, I listened to audiobooks for about the same number of hours. Now let's talk about audience spread, by which I mean the intended target audiences the books I'm reading are created for, going once again from least read read to most read. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I only read one children's book this past quarter, and that is the same number I read in the first quarter. I also read 3 middle grade books, and once again, that's actually the same exact number of middle grade books I read in quarter 1. In quarter 2, I read 8 young adult books, which is up 1 book compared to quarter 1. And my most read demographic by a country mile was adult books. I read 31 total adult books this past quarter, which is 5 more than I read in quarter 1. Next, we're going to do some long and short superlatives, starting with the longest book I read in the second quarter according to page count. That was The Odyssey as translated by Emily Wilson, which comes in at 582 pages. On the other hand, the shortest book I read according to page count was A Mouthful of Dust by Nhi Vo, which was a whopping 92 pages. When we're looking at the longest and shortest audiobooks, we actually have some variety this quarter because the longest audiobook I listened to was The Works of Vermin, which clocked in at 19 hours and 33 minutes. And my shortest audiobook was The Black God's Drums, which clocked in at 3 hours and 4 minutes. As for my most read authors of the quarter, of course, I read 2 amazing books from Katie Casey. I read all 3 books in the I Want to Be a Wall series by Shiro Honomi, and between catching up on her novella series and reading one of her standalones, I read 4 books from Nhi Vo, which honestly was time well spent. While we're talking about authors, let's chat through how many new authors I read from this past quarter. If we combine all definitions of new to me, that means I read from a total of 26 new authors, which is pretty good. If we get a bit more specific, I read from 11 debut authors, meaning I read the first book they had ever published, and I read from 15 new to me authors, meaning authors who have been published in some capacity before I read from them and whose work I was diving into for the first time. If we compare that to repeat authors, meaning authors whose work I've read from before and whose work I was returning to, new authors definitely won the day because I only read from 10 repeat authors. Also, if you're wondering why 26 plus 10 doesn't add up to the total of 43 books I read this past quarter, it's because I read more than one book from a few of my repeat authors, and for the sake of accuracy, they only get counted once. Next, we're going to take a look at my average star rating for the quarter, and on average, I rated my books about 4.3 stars. And again, for the sake of clarity, this average was calculated using a total of 41 books instead of 43 because there were 2 books I read in the second quarter that I did not give a star rating. While we're on the subject of star rating, I want to show some love for my 5-star reads of the quarter. I only had 3 of them, but they were 3 really spectacular books. Those were Along in Speaking Silence, Diamond Ring, and Ollie in Between. If we do the math on that, it doesn't seem very impressive at first glance because that means 5-star reads only made up about 7% of my overall reading in the second quarter, again going off a total of 41 books that I actually gave star ratings. But as I've said before, that really doesn't tell the whole story because I rated a lot of books 4.5 stars or 4.75 stars, and I definitely discovered some new favorites that were just not rated the full 5 stars, and that doesn't make them any less impactful or any less amazing. But enough about that, now let's talk about my most read publishers for the quarter. This is not going to account for every single book I read, it's just a representation of the publishers I read from the most. Going in ascending order, first we have Simon & Schuster, from whom I read 5 books. Then we have a tie for second place between HarperCollins at 6 books and Penguin Random House also at 6 books. And coming in at the top with an absolutely dominant performance is Macmillan. I read 12 books published under Macmillan imprints. Next is one of my favorite stats to look at every single quarter. That is, of course, the most popular cover colors. And this past quarter, we had 4 colors that really stood out. Before I share those, I want to once again remind you that this is more of a vibe than a science. A lot of covers are multicolored, and deciding which color is most dominant or most eye-catching can be very subjective. You don't have to agree with me, but there's also nothing you can do about my choices. With that said, the color white finally made it onto the leaderboard because I read 5 predominantly white books. Then we have orange, which again is not a color we typically see as the most popular, but I read 6 orange books. In second place is another somewhat unusual pick because it's black. I read a total of 8 black books. But even though we had some shakeups in this quarter's rankings, blue refuses to cede the throne because she is once again on top with 9 books. With that excitement behind us, it's time to do some series tracking. In the second quarter of 2026, I read 11 books in series, which is honestly pretty wild by my usual standards. I completely caught up on 2 series, I completed 2 series, and the rest were part of ongoing series. I read the last 2 books in the Unwritten Rules Companion Trilogy, I read the first book in the May and Malibu chapter book series, I caught up with the Nampesha Wayasit series, of course I read the 3 most recent novellas in the Singing Hill cycle, I read the first book in the Nameless Republic trilogy, In Your Court is intended to be the first book in a companion series, and of course, I read all 3 books in the I Wanna Be a Wall manga series. If we compare series reading to standalones, we'll see that once again, standalones have asserted their dominance, because if I read 11 books in series, that means the remaining 32 books were all standalone books. I also like to keep track of new releases versus backlist books. So 24 of the books I read this past quarter were 2026 releases, and the remaining 19 were all backlist books. Again, I'm pretty happy with that because it's almost a completely even split between the two. I always feel like I'm leaning a little bit too far into new releases, but tracking this comparison actually makes me feel like I'm doing a better job than I think. When we think about the most backlist book or books I read this past quarter, things get a little bit interesting. If you want to get like super technical, the most backlist book is kind of The Odyssey, because you could argue that it was first transcribed for public consumption all the way back in mid-6th century BCE, which, you know, was a while ago. But even if you don't lean on that technicality, the specific edition I read from, translated by Emily Wilson, was still first published back in 2018, making it one of the most backlist books I read this past quarter. I say one of because The Black God's Drums was also published back in 2018. Now we're going to take a little tour through the most notable book settings for the quarter. The range of specificity really varies on this depending on how much detail any given book wants to go into. So these could be countries, regions, continents, cities, so on and so forth. Starting out with my most read setting, which as always, to my great shame, is the United States. This is never going to be a surprise because as someone who primarily reads books that are written, published, and sold in the English-speaking market, this just tracks. So I read 20 books set in the United States. Next we have Not Set on Earth, which is a broad category that can include anything from books set entirely in fantasy worlds, books set in fantasy versions of the world that don't actually exist, or books set in space or on planets that are not Earth. So by that definition, I read 10 books not set on Earth. I read 3 books set in Japan, 2 books set in the United Kingdom, 2 books more broadly set in or across Europe, 1 book in Sri Lanka, 1 book set in the US and South Korea, 1 book set in the US and Istanbul, 1 book set in the US and Mexico, 1 book sort of set in ancient Greece, and 1 book set in West Africa. Now let's talk about how much money I saved by using my local library this past quarter. In total, I saved $183.82, which is actually about $111 more than I saved in the first quarter. For the first half of 2026, in total, I've saved $256.56. The $183.82 I saved this past quarter was split between 9 checkouts. I checked out 2 ebooks, 6 audiobooks, and 1 physical book. It's not really a statistic, but you all seem to enjoy the new tier ranking section in my first quarter stats video, so I'm bringing it back for quarter 2. Like I said last quarter, my tier ranking has turned out to be a reflection of my holistic reading experience. You might assume that there's a clear correlation between star rating and tier ranking, with 5-star books being S tier, 4 to 4.75 stars being A tier, and so on and so forth, but that really hasn't been my experience. Star rating isn't the only thing that impacts my ranking. It's about resonance, it's about enjoyment, it's about context and the overall reading experience, which means some of these titles end up in different tiers than you might think. Thankfully, we didn't have any F tier or D tier reads this quarter. Everything was pretty solid, so we'll go in ascending order, starting with my 2 C tier books. These are books that were enjoyable, compelling, entertaining. They offered some good takeaways and ideas, but were perhaps a little bit lacking in execution, at least for me. So my 2 C tier books were A Practical Guide to Dating a Demon and Shapes of Love. Moving right along to my B tier books. These are books I really enjoyed. I found they had clear and strong thematic overtones that were successfully conveyed and executed. They provided a strong level of entertainment, and I would consider them to be easy recommendations, even if I might have had 1 or 2 notable critiques. So my B tier books for the second quarter were Kareem Between, May and Malibu the Dream Team, To Ride a Rising Storm, Change of Plans, Startup Hell, The Killing Spell, An Expanse of Blue, Portia's Wrath, The Disaster Gay Detective Agency, The Open Era, The House of Now and Then, Perverts, Siren Queen, and Muñeca. The A tier is where most of my reads tend to live because I have a pretty good handle on my own reading taste at this point. These are high quality books. They're compelling, they're engaging, they have something clear to say, they're very well executed in more ways than one, and they're very strong candidates to become favorite books of the year. I had 20 A tier books this past quarter. Those were the works of Vermin, Fire Season, I'll Love You Forever, A Prince Among Pirates, Ship Happens, Opting Out, The Brides of High Hill, A Mouthful of Dust, The Black God's Drums, No God But Us, The Lost Book of Lancelot, Forgive Me Not, The Sons of El Rey, The Odyssey, 30 Love, Son of the Storm, In Your Court, and I Want to Be a Wall Volumes 1, 2, and 3. And finally, we come to the highly coveted S tier. For me, this tier represents books that really blew me away, books that are going to stay with me for a very long time and that I can see myself recommending over and over again for years to come. There likely isn't a single thing about them that I would change. The experience of reading them was immaculate and something really special. And with that in mind, I'm happy to say that 6 of the books I read this past quarter became S tier books. Those were Blood in the Machine, The Contract of Izuko, The Last Best Quest Ever, Along in Speaking Silence, Diamond Ring, and Ollie in Between. Normally I end my stats videos by talking through my top 5 favorite books of the quarter, but I kind of feel like you can glean which books were my favorite just from my tier rankings alone. And even though getting sick at the end of June kind of pushed my filming schedule back, I would still like to do some kind of mid-year video, whether that's the mid-year check-in or a video about my favorite books I read in the first half of the year, we'll have to see. But because of those reasons and to avoid any redundancy, I'm going to hold off on sharing a top 5. That's all the nitty-gritty statistics and data I had to share with you for this past quarter. I hope you found it interesting. If you'd like to share any of your own reading stats or share your favorite books that you read this past quarter, I'd love to hear all about it down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page. Bye.